Hello there, I'm David Tickner, the Chief Executive of the Civil Service Retirement Fellowship, and I'm delighted to welcome you to another episode of 60 Voices, which is a special podcast we launched to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the Civil Service Retirement Fellowship. In this series, we're sharing the fascinating stories and personal reflections of former civil servants as they look back on their careers and the impact they had on the nation. 60 Voices aims to conserve and preserve these important work memories. From the challenges they face to the memorable moments that define their work, each episode offers a unique personal insight into the history of the UK civil service and the people who helped shape it. Whether you're a former colleague or someone interested in public service, we invite you to join us as we explore the voices behind decades of dedication, service, and legacy. Joining me as usual for our podcast is my friend and co-host, Denise Headley. Denise is the CSRF's Deputy Chief Executive and has an extensive background in broadcasting and commentary, and also runs her own successful weekly podcast on politics and world affairs. For this episode, we are more than delighted to welcome our National Honorary President, Lord Mark Sedwill. A former Cabinet Secretary and head of the Home Civil Service, Lord Sedwill has had an interesting career at the top of the civil service, and we've managed to find a small window in his very busy schedule to discuss his career in a bit more detail. Mindful of the time, we have set 10 questions for him to answer in 60 minutes. So the countdown clock starts now. And a big welcome to you, Mark, and thank you very much indeed for joining us.
David, hi. Good to be with you. I'm glad we've been able to find the time to do this.
Thank you. And we'll kick straight off, because mindful of the 60 minutes, 10 questions, with my first question, which links around your origins as a civil servant. So I suppose what the audience would like to know is what initially motivated you to join the civil service and how your early experiences of that career helped shape your approach to public service.
Well, I didn't ever really regard myself, even though I ended up as head of it, as a civil servant, because I was really a diplomat. And so I joined the diplomatic service, not straight out of university, actually. I was recruited into it during my first degree. I was at St Andrews University for my first degree, and then had the opportunity to go and do a master's at Oxford. So they kindly said to me, "Yeah, you can go off and do your master's. Oxford will be good for you. It'll rub the edges off, and you can come back to us when you've grown up a bit more." I recall thinking to myself, "I'm never going to have the edges rubbed off." And there's one thing that I think did lead to a successful career. It's the fact I managed to maintain some edge. Notwithstanding the diplomatic service's desire to smooth me down a bit. So I joined the diplomatic service, and I joined the diplomatic service because I wanted to explore the world. I'd enjoyed traveling, really wanted to get under the skin of other countries. I had that kind of nomadic gene, if you like, in my DNA, and I thought that was a great way to really make an impact, do something interesting, explore new places, and so on. And so that's how I started out. And then kind of my career, I know we'll come on to this, so took me largely through serendipity into some domestic issues as well. And so that essentially my journey was one that was certainly never planned. Certainly to the top of the civil service was one I certainly didn't plan. And as I say, I started out very much as a young diplomat, as it turned out, heading off to the Middle East and South Asia.
And was it always your intention to be a diplomat? I mean, when you were doing this sort of career advisory, was that top of your list even way back then?
No, it wasn't. Actually, when I was at university, I was in the Royal Marines Reserves, and I also did some time with the Air Squadron. Didn't join the Officers Training Corps, actually, though I look back on it and think I know they had better parties than most of the rest of us. And the Royal Marines Reserve was that's proper reserve. That isn't just an OTC; it's a proper reservist force. And I did the training and so on with them. And so my intention, actually, although I did have some time to stay with the Air Squadron as well, my intention was to commission, go into the forces. And then the opportunity to join the Foreign Office came up. It was right at the end of the Cold War. And I recall my colonel, my commanding officer, saying to me, "Look, the truth is, you'll be fine as a Royal Marine. Be nice to have you. You'll probably only do a few years and you'll go off and do something else. let me tell you, something I think you will be good at is this. And if that's what the country, if that's what the country needs from you, if you want to do your duty, that's what the country needs from you. My advice, and advice kind of meant kind of direction really, is go and do that. Go do the thing you're going to be better at. And so that's what I went off to do.
Very good.
Right. Good to speak to you, Mark. So my question for you is leadership philosophy. Having held a number of senior roles, including the Cabinet Secretary and National Security Advisor, how would you describe your leadership style and how did it evolve over time?
I think the really big thing I've learned about leadership is that it is a state of mind and it's not about position. So when I was head of the civil service and talking to people about the kind of civil service I wanted to help develop in my time, I talked about a public service, actually not just a civil service, of leaders. And I would point out that it can often be the most junior member of a team in sort of hierarchy terms who is the natural leader, the person who watches out for other people. If someone is having a difficult time at home, puts their arm around them, the person who makes sure that everyone's included in the Christmas lunch, that the rosters are working, etc. So whatever it might be. And that can often be, as I say, the most junior member of the team. And I think I learned that. I think I learned that point quite early on because I saw people who were good at leadership at every level, and people who were bad at leadership at every level. And there were some very senior people who were just not natural leaders, and there were some very junior people who were. And so I always sort of try to model my leadership on that kind of behavior, and recognizing that there isn't one size fits all. I would always say, and still say, if I'm talking to groups about leadership, it isn't about you, it's about them. Not about, I have my leadership style, I have my leadership brand, I have all this. Of course, you've got to be authentic to yourself. But actually, you have to adjust your leadership style, your priorities, to the needs of the team or the organization you're leading. And sometimes you might be leading an organization, as I was when I went to the Home Office, that it was coming, had been through one of those perennial crises that the Home Office is going through again. And so that needed a particular style of leadership. When I became National Security Advisor, I was leading a very effective community. I wasn't actually in charge of very much. But I was leading a very effective community of big leaders that needed a different kind of leadership style. And I can say the same right the way through my career.
Just let me give you a quick question. So, in a situation, could you give us an example of how, in a maybe like you just said, national security issue, or in a previous role where you started off with one leadership style, circumstances popped in, and you had to say, "Okay, I need to do something different."
So my style at the Home Office evolved over time, and I think if you're successful, it should. And I remember talking to a colleague, a senior perm sec, still a perm sec actually, and saying your leadership style, and this was reflecting my own time at the Home Office, needs to evolve from people saying you're great to you and your department are great to the department is great. And so I went to the Home Office. It was in crisis, and I made my mission over the 4.5 years I was there. I was essentially given this task by Theresa May, who was Home Secretary when I arrived. It was Amber Rudd when I left, of restoring the Home Office as a great department of state. This was a phrase that mattered a lot to her. One of the great departments of state, alongside the Treasury and the Foreign Office, and she wanted the Home Office restored to that status in Whitehall. And so to start with, I had to be very hands-on, identifying where the problems were, gripping things, making changes to the management and the leadership, et cetera, et cetera. And what I tried to do over time, not always successfully actually, was move into a more arm's length, enabling, empowering, sort of chairman-like style of leadership rather than kind of grippy operational style of leadership, because I'd built a team in whom I had a great deal of confidence. And so I actively, not always successfully, I think they would tell you sometimes I still was a bit grippy and headmasterly, than they'd want me to be at the end. And actually, that's probably why I felt it was time to move on. But I did consciously try to evolve my style over time.
I mean, leadership. Sorry. Yeah, I was going to say that neatly tees up for the next question, because obviously one element of leadership is how you handle crisis. And obviously you, in your career in the civil service, have been through some fairly significant moments in UK national and international moments. I mean, Brexit and obviously the early stages of COVID, two that particularly spring to mind. And I suppose just reflecting a bit broader, I mean, when you were dealing with those, what sort of, for you, were the biggest challenges of how do you manage government through these uncertain moments? Because they've both been, I mean, there's still obviously the audits being run on, certainly on COVID, that inquiry is still running to a certain degree. But I mean, those particular elements obviously require, I would imagine, a certain type of leadership in particular moments like that. And obviously, it'd be great to share your thoughts since you were at the helm of all of that during those particular elements.
Yeah, and David, I'd been through a series of crises throughout my career: terrorist attacks, the Salisbury attack, more recently when I was National Security Advisor. But I dealt with a whole load. And actually, to go back to the question that Nottingham and I were just discussing a minute ago, right at the beginning of my career, one of the first things I dealt with in Egypt on my first posting as a young diplomat was we had a very nasty terrorist attack in which British tourists were killed. And I was a sort of junior second secretary. And I sort of volunteered to go off and be on the ground and try and liaise with the local police and liaise with them. It was kind of me. I was the only guy.
Yeah.
And so I was learning, sort of applying the kind of leadership I guess I'd learned through sports and school and whatever. In those circumstances, I had to turn up and deal with some very badly frightened people, including people who had been close to those who'd been injured or killed. Families at home who were clearly very, very worried about them, wanted their family members home, etc. And I was in my mid-20s, and I wasn't leading in the sense of managing anything. I wasn't in charge of anyone, but I was in charge of the situation on the ground with obviously my ambassador and bosses back in Cairo. And I had to sort of do what I've always said to people since with crises, which is leadership in crisis is like leadership at any time, except it's just more so. It's kind of normal leadership, but on steroids. And so if leadership is about identifying the big issues and big ideas, you're picking a great team and empowering them, and then, in my view, staying calm and presenting oneself in a way that enables people to be the best of themselves. I learned, or at least relearned, a lot of that during that incident. What were the really big things I had to focus on at that time? Who could I assemble around me to help me with it? Could I, with the Egyptian police and the local staff and all the rest of it? But in particular, not being complacent, but staying calm. And I think that's critically important in a crisis because people are under pressure. They're very stressed. As in COVID, they're worried about their families as well, not just the professional challenge, but the personal side of it. And as I said to the COVID inquiry, I didn't have the luxury of running around, say, we're all doomed, everything's terrible, the system's broken, that guy in Dad's Army, don't panic, don't panic. I had to project calm and confidence because if I had a system on the edge of panic, and if I hadn't done that, it would have tipped over into panic, and then we're in an even worse situation. And sometimes that means you get, some people definitely thought I looked a bit complacent as a result of that. I don't think I was, but I was deliberately, I thought, one person has to show they have some confidence here. One person has to be calm, not sort of getting blown about by events. And that was true. That was something I'd learned through all of those crises. So when I talk to people about crisis management, whether it's a strategic crisis like COVID or whatever, or it's an immediate crisis like a terrorist attack or a flood, or people managing the terrible hurricanes in Jamaica right now as we're recording this, etc. Staying calm, projecting calm is critically important if you're the person in charge, because that enables people around you. It has a feedback loop. It enables people around you.
Did you find it more challenging handling the Brexit scenario to COVID, or was it? I mean, they're obviously very different navigations, but I mean, I wonder whether there was one or other that you found a bit more challenging than the other, or that you just
I don't think you don't sort of rate them on a league table, really. It's just as you say, they're different. They're different kinds of things. And actually, I mean, by far the worst issue I ever dealt with, and of course, it's the same issue has come back again. Was the child sex abuse inquiry after the whole Jimmy Savile affair broke, which is now over a decade ago, and the sort of levels of public anxiety and the conspiracy theories, etc., there were around that, and some of the mishandling of some of those. The the witness who turned out to be a fabricator that fueled a whole load of those things, and so on. And that was by far the hardest thing I ever dealt with. And the reason it was harder than anything else I ever dealt with, notwithstanding the fact the political environment was toxic for some of it, was because it was the most difficult at which to maintain professional detachment and bring that professional, dispassionate, sort of analytical approach that one needs to as a public servant to that issue. Because every time the issue came to me, I couldn't help but react first as a sort of father, and trying to control the emotional reaction to those terrible abuses, and still maintain the professional detachment was by far the hardest thing I ever did.
Thank you. Dee?
Thank you. I think that's quite interesting how you led into that conversation about maintaining those boundaries, because the next question I've got for you is about balancing politics and neutrality. And as a UK's top civil servant, how do you navigate that delicate balance between political priorities and the duty of the civil service to be impartial? And I think you kind of alluded to some of the difficulties that you've had in that specific case, but maybe you could expand on that with other examples.
Well, I think I actually never found that particular challenge, that particular issue challenging, because I was always very, very clear that the ministers, politicians, we live in a democracy. They have the democratic mandate. No matter how important a role I was playing, I didn't have a democratic mandate. They did, and so of course there are rules to it. You've got to operate within the rule of law, etc., within the civil service code. But he was always very clear with people, if you don't, the professional obligation is to provide the best advice you can, irrespective of the starting point, the prejudices, the positions of your political leaders. Tell them the truth, give them the best advice you can, do so in a way that actually is smart, and therefore it's not just speaking truth to power, it's speaking truth to power in a way that means that power is actually paying attention and listening to you at the time, because that's an important part too. And I guess being a diplomat has helped me with that. But then in the end, they make the decision, and we then just one decision made, we just get on with it. And if you can't do that, choose a different career. I mean, I was always very clear with people about that. Just choose a different career. So I never found that actually particularly difficult. Some of the issues are very difficult. And sometimes you have ministers who don't want to hear the inconvenient truth, but that isn't a sort of party political issue. It's much more sort of a personal style issue. And you've just got to handle that. And by the way, it's not always about sort of left-right party politics. So something that always struck me being at the Home Office was Home Secretaries actually kind of organised themselves on a different spectrum. So it wasn't sort of some Home Secretaries were left of centre, some Home Secretaries were right of centre in the traditional way we tend to think about it. Home Secretaries tended to be on a sort of libertarian, authoritarian spectrum. And you often wouldn't know what their party affiliation was from the way they did the job of being Home Secretary. So there were Labour Home Secretaries who were highly sort of authoritative, really quite authoritarian, quite controlling, talked a lot about social control, and Labour Home Secretaries who were quite libertarian, and there were Tory Home Secretaries who were also both of those, from both of those different tribes, if you like. And so I could certainly identify, I'm not going to name names, but excuse me, I could certainly identify Tory, Conservative and Labour Home Secretaries who had more in common with each other than they did with other members of their own party, and indeed with other people who'd done that job. And so one had to sort of deal with that in that way. But in the end, your job is to support the elected politicians of the day, give them your best advice, implement their decisions. I never found that part difficult at all, because I just felt that was part of the job.
Did you ever come away from a meeting with a decision and you thought, that's absolutely pants, but you did it anyway?
Yes. But by the way, that's true in any institution. So that isn't a thing that only relates to a decision taken by a minister. Yeah, we all have a boss, and in the end, if you're in a team, in any walk of life, it can be a sports team, it can be a charity, it can be local government, it can be a business, whatever. Yeah, there's a discussion about an issue. Someone takes it. In the end, someone takes the decision. The boss takes a decision, or there's a collective decision, or whatever it might be. You might have argued the toss. You might be against the decision that's been taken, but part of being a member of any team is collective responsibility. And you say, okay, well, they heard me out. They didn't agree with me. They've taken the decision. I understand why. I disagree, but hey, it's their job. My job is now to implement that decision. It's not a student debating society. You have to remind people of that sometimes. Decision taken, get on with it. And that's part of the discipline of being in any organization. If you can't do that, then you can't work in any organization that requires that kind of discipline and self-discipline. And that's true of the private sector, the third sector, as much as it is of the public service.
Dee?
Thank you. I mean, you said at the top of the interview, Mark, obviously that you originally you entered as a diplomat. You've also done quite a considerable amount of national security work. So our next question frames around that element of security and foreign affairs specifically. And what would be interesting is to get your insights as to how those roles that you were doing gave you an understanding of the way in which diplomacy, intelligence, and policy making intersect in the arena in which you were working.
So I think we often overestimate the difference, in a way, at least psychologically, between diplomacy and domestic policy, foreign policy and domestic policy. So the truth, of course, in diplomacy is you don't have much control of what is going on. You have control of your own position, UK's position. We have we're an important country, Security Council, one of the biggest defense budgets in the world, and certainly one of the most effective militaries, global diplomatic service, world-class intelligence services, big aid budget, much reduced recently, regrettably, but still a big aid budget, etc., etc. So you have a whole load of assets. But fundamentally, one is dealing with issues where there are any number of other players and influences, some aligned with us, some not. And one is having to navigate that complexity and ask, okay, what is the unique role the UK can play here to help move this in the direction that we believe is right, whether in our interests or in the interests of our allies or whatever. And I would often talk about this: what is our catalytic intervention? It doesn't. There's no point saying, well, what is the British policy on this, unless that policy is actually going to achieve something that we believe to be in our interest, supporting our values, whatever it might be. And so you become very used to in the diplomatic sphere the fact you're dealing with complexity and the levers are indirect and your influence is limited, and you have to then assemble a coalition and use persuasion and be really thoughtful about the most effective use of the levers that we have available to us, whether those are economic, diplomatic, intelligence, military, whatever. We sometimes forget that is the case in domestic policy as well. And this was something I was very keen to try and get people to think about in domestic policy. Now, of course, the government in many areas has a great deal of control. In health, the biggest employer in Western Europe is the National Health Service. It's a huge institution that provides all of us with our healthcare in the United Kingdom. But ask any health secretary how much control he or she has over that institution, and they would describe it very much as I've just described being a diplomat. And of course, the National Health Service, even though it's the biggest player by far, is not the only player in determining the nation's health. There are all sorts of other things, including, of course, every citizen as well. It's a highly complex and disaggregated institution. And so I often think that in domestic policy, we needed to have the same frame of mind, recognize that government is a big actor, in many cases, the most important actor in any situation, whether it's economic policy or social policy or security policy, but it's far from the only actor. And it's still about then sort of a system leadership, if you like. This is one of the agenda items I sought to promote as head of the civil service, is recognizing that every government department is really a system leader, not just an organization. And their job is to try and assemble a coalition, if you like, across the entire system, public, private, third sector, get as much of that aligned with the agenda they've been told to pursue as they possibly can, identify where the opponents or frictions or vested interests might be, work out ways of dealing with those, and recognize the complexity of it. And so I guess I brought that diplomatic bias to domestic policy, and not an area I was ever really an expert in. But I think that perspective on being comfortable with complexity, comfortable with the fact that not all the levers were in my hands, and seeing my job as essentially trying to assemble a sort of alignment of interests, of unity of purpose, if not unity of control, was something I felt comfortable with, because that's what I spent my career doing.
Okay, so civil service reform. What are the biggest changes you believe the civil service needs to make and remain effective in a fast changing world? And if you could also consider that in relation to the changes in the civil service, because people don't have a career for life, and it's a much more churning organization in terms of people's career times there.
Yeah. Well, I spoke about this actually 5 years ago when I left, and I think obviously some things have changed, but I think some of those points I made remain valid. The biggest thing the civil service needs to do, and actually the public service as a whole, not just the civil service. The civil service is about 10%, probably a bit less, of the whole of the public service. And by the way, Whitehall is less than 10% of the civil service. And in the public discourse, people sometimes think all of that's Whitehall. And Whitehall's about something less than 1% of the total public service, and yet they are the system leaders. So they're important, but they're not very many of them. And so people often think civil service reform is about Whitehall reform, and Whitehall reform is usually about people saying, well, let's just get some different clever people in to replace the clever people we have already. Not the usual suspects. If you
Neatly done.
So actually, but the really big thing that we need to do to public service reform as a whole is apply technology to crack this question of essentially stagnant public sector productivity. And I think there are smart ways and less smart ways of doing that. There are quite a lot of people in the public service as a whole, including the big civil service areas, tax, benefits, immigration, casework, these casework functions, who are doing what are actually really quite hard, repetitive, not always very interesting jobs. And a lot of that, because it's largely about following rules and applying rules and systems and so on, quite complex rules and systems to individual cases, can quite clearly be, over the next few years, be done with the support of AI. And indeed, that means not that you replace everyone, but that someone who could do 10 cases a day could do 100 cases a day, because AI is helping them support it. And of course, that will mean there'll be fewer people doing that casework, and that needs to be managed compassionately and so on over time. But it should also mean, and I think this is a really important point, I call this dual channel shift when I gave my farewell lecture, that if we can free up resources which drives productivity, good thing, money back to the center, or money back to the taxpayer, or money back to do other things, that's all good. But it should also enable us to provide a better service, a more human service, a more bespoke service to those people who really need it. And so while many of us, I would count myself as one of these, would be very happy to self-serve on pretty much everything that I need the state for, and I'm actually now much more able to do so. Passport service is virtually entirely online, very, very efficient. Only 10 years ago, it was going through a major crisis. Driving licenses, all that kind of thing, are pretty efficient now. Tax is going that way, and so on as well. So that's what I want from the state, just to be able to do it online like I do everything else. But there are many people who have complex needs, people with addictions, people with health problems, former offenders, all the rest of it, people from troubled families, et cetera, who are more reliant on the state, more reliant on more parts of the state, and who therefore are more likely to be having to navigate more of the complexity of the state than, say, I do, more dependent on all of those things, and probably least able to navigate the complexity of the state because of their personal circumstances. And so if we're really smart, we could free up some of those resources by improving efficiency through the application of technology to allow a more bespoke, more human service, a more sort of account manager kind of service, personal service for those people who are most dependent on the state and find navigating the complexity of the state at national and local level, by the way, most difficult.
I mean,
And I think that's a tremendously exciting agenda for the state to pursue. I don't think we should just see this in terms of numbers and efficiency. I think it's a tremendously exciting agenda. And I think, by the way, we see some parts of the state already doing that. So, I always used to get out and about when I was cabinet secretary. I used to say to some of my departmental heads, actually, look, don't be in a position where I know more about what's going on in your business than you do, because I'm out and about and you aren't. And I remember going to a Job Centre Plus, I think in the Northwest. It may have been Newcastle, I can't remember, but anyway, certainly the Northwest, and seeing an experiment they were pursuing whereby they were dealing with ex-offenders, and they were essentially giving these ex-offenders a personal service, but actually much of what they were doing was negotiating with businesses, some businesses, as part of their social contribution, were willing to take on ex-offenders, knowing that not all of those offenders would continue to be ex-offenders. Some of them would offend again. Many of them had complex needs. Many of them had addictions. Many of them found the discipline of working very difficult, and were willing to take that overhead on and give them the support they needed to try and get them back into a more productive way of life. And that job centre was you had individuals looking after the people with the needs, but also essentially account managing the relationships with the businesses who were willing to take those people on. And I thought that was an inspirational example of how I felt the public service should go. You actually be devoting real resources to those areas where people have those needs, and paying for that by being able to make dramatic efficiencies through the use of technology to everyone else, and therefore moving away from the kind of one size fits all, which means one size doesn't fit anyone approach that traditionally these big systems have.
I mean, I would certainly think that everything you've said there would echo very neatly with our community, many of whom are obviously what is technically known as the fourth age, over the age of 80. And there's a considerable amount of frustration, I think, within that particular age bracket, that they are being left behind. And the sort of the initiatives, whilst laudable, that you've obviously cited, that will make efficiencies in their minds, they don't perhaps always see how that directly impacts and connects on how they go about doing what they're doing, or being able to do what they need to do and have somebody on the end of the phone, or be able to go and get something done on a personal level because they don't have a computer.
Yeah. Well, and that's absolutely right. That we're increasingly in a society where the inclusion-exclusion agenda is going to be digital, or is going to be sort of technological. And there will be people, and as you say, naturally, it's harder for the elderly. By the way, my father-in-law is 92 and highly technically able, so it's not purely an age thing.
Yeah.
He's better than most of his kids. But you're absolutely right. There will be people who will struggle with that and who want a human being and need a personal service. And it won't always be people with very complex needs. I mean, I talked about the most acute cases, people with addictions and ex-offenders and so on. You said there'll simply be people who are, later on in life, you're dealing with all the sort of health problems you tend to have as you get older, who just need a personal service and actually need the personal contact, because they may well find that their life has become more isolated as they become older, and so on. It's a very common phenomenon. And who find being left at the end of a cascading menu with a computer voice on the phone very, very frustrating. And as I say, I hope that if we can drive dramatic productivity improvements into the public service as a whole, so not just the civil service, then some of the resources released will enable us to look after all of those people who need the personal service better. And by the way, those are much more satisfying jobs for the civil servants and other public servants who are doing them, because they feel they're making a genuine contribution and not just working their way down a checklist and essentially being treated as though they were a computer. They just happen to be a computer in human form.
Just
So
to
I think
jump on that
there may
very
be
quick-
fewer jobs, but they should be more satisfying jobs for those who are doing it.
Just to jump on that quickly, you know the point about the civil service itself changing. If we have such a I won't call it a revolution, but a significant change where we move quite our way over to AI, doesn't that then change the nature of government in a sense? Because essentially what we're then doing is we still the civil service, but we don't necessarily have the people in the same way. We've got everything is so much more automated. So therefore we've got less people. And in a sense, the government changes. Would you agree with that? Or do you think that's just totally off the beaten track?
No. It would change, but if we're smart about it, it changes for the better. I mean, all waves of automation over the last 200 years have generally, of course, there are losers in the short term, but have generally created more opportunities, removed drudgery, removed danger from many, many jobs where machines can do things more efficiently and more safely than humans were able to in the past. You think of the big industrial changes. And I think one of the things that the civil and public service is wrestling with is that same phenomenon that we've seen if you like in blue collar work, if we can still use that kind of old fashioned way of characterizing it, over the last couple of 100 years, is now coming into white collar work. And that is a natural phenomenon. And of course, it will change things. But I think if we're smart, what it means is that there'll be a premium on people who have as much EQ as IQ. They'll need both. You still need to be smart, but you need to be empathetic as well. I think that's what makes a really great public servant. Those people will have more satisfying jobs. There will be fewer of them because, as I said, a caseworker who could do 10 will be able to do 100 or 1,000 cases a day, with the application of AI. And those people who are no longer working in those jobs can go and find other things to do, which will also be more satisfying. And these transitions are hard. There will be losers. There will be people who find it very, very difficult, who find it hard to retrain. We've seen that with previous waves of automation. And we've got to manage that skillfully and compassionately. But fundamentally, it's a better place for us to be. And you're right, it is a different service. But as long as we regard AI as the tool, not the master, then I think we can manage those frictions to the benefit of ourselves. But more importantly, the clue is in the name, the civil and public service. And it's the citizens we serve that matter.
Absolutely.
Most.
I say 100 years from now, our local groups might comprise of robot holograms that engage in sets and looking forwards. I mean, just on a very quick to conclude that point, there was on everything you said, very interesting feature in this week's Economist about actually how the newly retired, the 60-year-olds are overtaking the 16 to 24-year-olds in terms of their embracing of digital technology. So surveys have shown that they have actually voraciously, seeking out all of the technological smartphones, TVs, laptops, and all the rest of it on a far greater scale than the teenage age bracket. That holds
people really do.
Yeah.
You look at if you're running a small business, you can now do an awful lot of your tax on your smartphone. You don't need to be sitting in front of a 2-foot screen with spreadsheets. You can do it that way. In my sort of commercial life, where I have to sort of manage this kind of thing now, if I need to, I just take a photograph of a receipt. It's uploaded into some accounting software which reads the receipt, works out the VAT, pops it into the accounting software, and then my accountant kind of just has all of that coming in. That kind of thing. That's an immense improvement
Gone are the giant boxes under the with all the receipts going
my
through.
fiance tells me he still deals with quite a lot of people who do that, because of course I live in a rural area, so there's still quite a bit of that around. But the point is that those facilities are now available out there, as you say, in the wider sector, and of course the civil and public service have to be all over that. And by the way, you look at the more innovative parts of, say, the health service. They're on this already. You see the number of tablets you see around now, iPads and so on around now being used to provide a better service. My doctor, young guy, is completely unashamed about just checking with Google, or a version of Google, a sort of medical version of Google online, if I'm having a conversation with him, just to sort of make sure he's up with the absolute latest research on something.
Yeah.
And he doesn't feel that he's lost authority by doing that. Whereas, of course, 50 years ago, doctors came out of their training, may never do any other training again, and then worked for 40 years, desperately trying to remember what they knew when they were 25 years old. He would think that's insane. He's staying up with all the latest research, all the latest guidance, and he's doing it online in real time with a patient who's sitting next to him and saying, okay, we've had a look at your blood test, we had a look at this, that, and the other. This helps me work that out.
I mean, it is very clever. I mean, not dwelling too much, we could probably speak for an hour on AI alone, but I mean, I think even one of the founding fathers have said that you're not going to get the genie back in the bottle now. I mean, it's now there.
Didn't try.
Exactly.
It'd be completely crazy to try. And it's, as I say, it offers huge potential to enhance both the quality and efficiency of the service that the public services provide to the citizen. If we're genuine public servants, that's got to be good.
No, absolutely. Just as a slight tangential angle, Tina, touching on your international experience and in the context of what you've just been talking about in terms of civil service reform and all of the initiatives that you've touched on, what did you bring back? I mean, you obviously served all over the world, and you've obviously seen political and cultural environments very different to the UK. In many aspects, but obviously we learn from all sorts of different experiences. Ministers are forever off on fact-finding trips to different parts of the globe to learn how other places run. What would you say were some of the sort of key elements that you've taken away from your international experience that you brought back and found very helpful in terms of looking forward to how we do things in the UK?
Well, I mean, just as an aside, something my predecessor as Cabinet Secretary, the late, great Jeremy Hayward, instituted was essentially a piece of research that compared the UK public service to counterparts around the world.
Oh, interesting.
And we looked at, it was independently done, and it looked at, it was probably about a dozen different elements, and sort of then looked at best in class, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, across the board, we did pretty well. I think in most areas we were within the top three. Some we weren't. Some we were at the top. And so I took that and thought, right, okay, well, let's sort of treat ourselves like a decathlete. And rather than just saying, okay, well, overall we came top or second and so on by adding up the points, let's actually work out who is the absolute best in this, and what are the lessons that will apply to us. And so can we raise our game in different ways and learn from different countries, not say, okay, we want to be like Singapore, we want to be like Estonia, we want to be like Australia. But okay, Australia's great at some things, Estonia's brilliant at others, Singapore's brilliant at a third set. Let's learn from all of those different examples. But it is striking how smaller countries often do this really well. So Estonia, for example, digital government, really, really impressive. A lot of government in Singapore, a lot of different elements of Singapore's government, very good as well. New Zealand and actually the Scottish government, interestingly, because we can learn from our own governments as well, had a thing I was sort of trying to introduce, which is a kind of national balance scorecard to look at how we were performing against a whole range of different things. It's sort of picking up the national wellbeing idea that the Cameron government had sort of started work on. But the other place I thought was always very interesting to learn from was the United States, because most domestic and social policy in the United States is run at the state level, And so you have this laboratory, or actually set of laboratories, 50 of them, within a single system, federal system, where because of the political differences there, loads of different approaches are being tried. And so you can actually look at the United States and say, well, okay, Florida's doing this and Texas is doing that, and Washington State's doing something else. Let's learn and see which of those things is most effective. And of course, one of the big reforms in law and order, which was the zero tolerance approach. Don't just walk past the broken window and the vandalism, because actually it's at the heart of what becomes a much more toxic and serious set of crimes. So care about those things and you'll create a better environment within which you can deal with the more serious crimes as well, which came out of New York, I think originally, was one that was then applied by various police forces in the UK. It's that kind of thing I think one should be looking to. So the answer is everywhere.
Thank you. Good answer. Dee?
Well, not everywhere.
Yeah,
Some places are very badly run. You
Yeah,
get
but
my
that point you just made about learning lessons internationally, I think one of the things that happened in Glasgow was that they imported how they dealt with people who were long-term substance abusers, and they took a completely different approach that then had a knock-on effect on localized violence, and then that had a localized effect on health outcomes. So it's about looking at government in a very holistic way. Okay, so my question is
Well,
about
as you know, Dean, that was my complete obsession when I was in government. One of the nicest things that was said about me when I left, they did the civil service weekly or quarterly, I think, did a piece where they got other people to talk about me when I left. And one of them said, they put it in the headline, he lived and breathed joined up government. And I
Yeah.
thought, oh, thank God somebody got
Because you mentioned this thing here, system leader. Back in the day, I used to be a local councillor. So I know a bit about internal government, local government at the local level. And the system leader approach, in my opinion, was very much the old scrutiny function before we had the cabinet function, because you would have residents with a budget and they are local, and they therefore can link directly into those areas where we need things. Whereas you have a cabinet system, it's a much more detached element. So I think, the system leader approach and holistic government's really, really important. So mentorship and talent. What advice would you give to young civil servants or future leaders about building careers of impact and also careers with integrity?
So I think the most important word, and in my answer, is one you used in the question, which is impact. Of course, we need people with the right values: integrity, compassion, service ethic, teamwork, etc. The words change over the years, but those are the public service values fundamentally. And we have to ensure we find people with those values, and we then also have to make sure that that we reward and nurture them, and make it as easy as possible. We make sure the incentives in the system encourage those things, and don't require people to apply their values against the incentives in the system to sort of overcome those incentives. And sometimes that is the case. But the key word, I think, in many ways, is impact. So my advice to young public servants of all kinds, to use a military phrase, is march to the sound of gunfire. Actually ask work out what is the big issue in whatever area you're working in at the time. What is the big issue? What is the thing that matters most? What can you do in your way to try and move the dial in your time in a job on that issue that is available to you? And that, again, is, of course, leading from behind, if you like, not necessarily leading from the top. And if you do that and treat every job as an opportunity to make an impact, not just pursue your career, then you will probably have a successful career.
Because it almost be like incidental, that, what did they say? Life is what happens when you're busy doing other things.
So my career was almost entirely incidental. I never planned. No one believes this, but I didn't plan it ever. I had a couple of jobs that I really wanted to do, which as I was coming up, we were coming into sight. One was the political director job in the Foreign Office, and one was National Security Advisor. And I got to do both of them on their own, at least for a very short time. Political director, because I was then sent off to run the Home Office, and National Security Advisor because I was then had to take on the Cabinet Secretary role because Jeremy Hayward tragically fell ill. And so in a sense, the only jobs I planned for were the ones and got were the ones that I actually didn't get to do for very long, at least entirely on their own. And almost everything else happened because I'd done what I just said to you, and opportunities came my way.
So you've never harbored any aspirations for being an ambassador then, no?
So I did. And I know what you're referring to, and I'll come back.
I don't know what you mean. I made no comment other than a general question.
But let me give you an example of that, because when I was in my sort of late 30s, I think I applied for still full-time diplomat.
Yeah.
I applied for the number 3 job in New York, at the UN in New York, which is a fantastic job. Loads of fascinating policy and so on, and really high impact. You have 2 ambassadors above you, the ambassador to the UN and the deputy, who kind of share out the representation roles. And you're the kind of your job is to kind of be the chief, the brains of the thing to try and deploy. Absolutely great job. Still is a great job. And a friend and contemporary got it, and I didn't get it, and I was a little felt okay. I thought I had a good chance of it, and then I happened to be walking down the corridor in the Foreign Office, feeling a bit grumpy about that. And the guy who was about to go out, Mark Lyle Grant, actually, who was about to go out to Pakistan as I had a mission there, as a High Commissioner there, said to me, "Oh, here you can get it. Do you want to come to Pakistan and be my number 2?" And I talked to my wife, and I said, "Yeah, okay." And if I look back on my career, that was probably the job, because of the nature of what the events that happened in Pakistan at that time, and the range of things I had to do and deal with and so on, as his deputy, as Mark's deputy, was probably the job that propelled me forward to the very big jobs I did later: ambassador in Afghanistan, NATO rep, Home Office, etc. I can think of a single job that sort of suddenly put me into that onto that more almost vertical trajectory. It was that job.
Yeah.
And it was a job I hadn't intended to get, and I only kind of got because I didn't get the job I really wanted. Now,
So would you still be open to that new challenge if it happened to land on your desk?
So I know what you're talking about. You're talking about Washington. So look, I've been out for 5 years. There are some great candidates in the system. I'm not going to apply for it. I don't think it's right for me to do so. Never say never. You never, if you get a call that says your country, duty calls, then we all have that gene still. But I'm not expecting that, and I'm absolutely confident they will find a really first-rate candidate from within the system. And it's right they do so. I mean, I've been out 5 years.
Jolly good. We're coming towards the end of your 10 questions. You're probably relieved to think you're nearly finished. My last question before I hand over to Dee to do the last one is specifically about public perception towards the civil service. I mean, there's always been, as you will know, we see, the public don't always get it right in the way they view the civil service, because depending on what newspaper they read or what reports are. But I suppose my question to you is, how can the civil service maintain credibility and trust? Because with the onslaught of media reporting, etc., it's increasing.
And the news cycle.
And the news cycle, it is increasingly more difficult to obviously get some of the positive messages out against some of the negative reporting that you may be up against on a daily or hourly basis, even these days.
So the short answer is delivery. I mean, in my time, actually, if you looked at the polling of public confidence in institutions, and I used to rather enjoy pointing this out, the civil service actually was rising in public confidence, and levels of public confidence in the civil service were in the 60% sort of territory, and we're approaching levels of confidence and trust in doctors, firefighters, I think, etc., nurses, and so on. I used to point out that was about 3 to 4 times levels of public confidence in politicians and journalists.
Again,
so criticism from politicians and journalists, I used to say to the civil service, these guys are not in glass houses and they're throwing an awful lot of stones. Now, I do think, however, that doesn't mean that one should be complacent. I mean, I don't want to sound flippant about that. But the reason for that, we looked at why was that the case. And truthfully, it wasn't because brilliant people in Whitehall were doing a brilliant job on system leadership and all these other things we were talking about. it was because the people were seeing at the sharp end was better delivery from the civil servants that they encountered, of the kind that I was describing earlier in that job centre example. And so what was certainly clear to me at the time was the way to maintain public trust and public confidence was to just be better and better and better at our core job, which is looking after the interests of the citizens, serving them, and all the rest of it. And you had to kind of just accept there'd be quite a lot of noise around in the political space. Now, I think there are two factors, however, I think have changed and mean that we can't just rest on that. Delivery is critically important, but I think there are two other factors. One is Brexit, and indeed the Scottish referendum, the 2014 referendum, not just the 2016 referendum on Scottish independence, put the civil service, like the judiciary, the worst example was the enemies of the people accusation against some very senior judges, actually, not against civil servants, into a space where we didn't become politicized, but we were accused of becoming politicized, of not remaining impartial, of being complicit in one side or the other of the debate. And that happened in Scotland in the 2014 referendum. It clearly happened over Brexit in the national referendum in 2016 and the aftermath. And that clearly damaged the image, unfairly in my view. I think we actually strained to be impartial and strained to support governments with very, very different political views as to what the right answer was through that period. And actually, I thought did a pretty good job of it. Which is generally not a pretty good job, a superb job of it. But that clearly had an effect because enough mud is slung, some of it sticks. And so you have to kind of deal with that. And I think that remind people of the benefits of having a genuinely impartial, professional public service with the civil services part of it. And as I say, judiciary, ditto. They face this too. I think the one that I think, and I'm less, because it mostly happened after my time, is COVID. And I think the perception, some of which is clearly correct, that public service productivity has gone off the edge of a cliff since COVID, that the preference is now to work from home, not work in the office, all of that kind of thing, has damaged perceptions of the public service because it makes the civil service look as though they're essentially freeloading and not working hard to the benefit of the citizen. Now, of course, that doesn't mean we should abandon flexible working and all of that kind of thing. Obviously, I'm not saying that. But we do need to be conscious if the civil service appear to have decided they're going to have terms and conditions that the wider citizenry do not have, notwithstanding the differences in pay and pensions and all the rest of it, but just a different way of working and others don't have that, then that is damaging to the reputation of the civil service. And by the way, I genuinely believe, of course, people should work from home when it's appropriate. There are times when actually it's the best way to get something done. If you need to be away and concentrate on something, it can be. But flexible working can't become inflexible working. And particularly our younger colleagues need the mentoring and example and social connection and network of being around colleagues. Human beings are social animals, and that is true of institutions. And so I think it is really damaging if the civil service looks as though we sort of detached ourselves from the experience of the rest of the citizens and are kind of lazing around, not working on their behalf. Not all of that is fair, but not all of it is unfair either. And that's really important.
Good answer. Dee, the last question of the
Oh,
term.
thank you very much for that. And Mark, can I just say, I've enjoyed the conversation with you. I'm really glad
Thank
you've
you.
agreed. No, I'm really glad you agreed to be on 60 Voices. I think sometimes people are a little bit uncertain about how it's going to go, but I think this has been a really good conversation. So thanks very much for joining. So personal reflections, looking back, what is the achievement that you're most proud of and the decision or moment you wish you could approach differently?
I thought, I have thought about this issue quite a bit. I mean, I think in some ways, I think the way we handled the Salisbury attack was a great example of how, in particular, the national security community would pull together, handle a crisis, and it absolutely exemplified that whole fusion doctrine approach, joined up government approach that I had made very much my focus. And so probably of any particular single thing, it's that. I'm very proud actually of the work I did in Afghanistan. And we don't have time to talk about all of that. And of course, Afghanistan.
Maybe there's a part 2, Mark.
Yeah,
Yeah, we'll have to invite you back.
well, Afghanistan, of course, turned out very badly. But actually, at the time, I think we were on the right track, and I was very proud of the part I played in helping to achieve that. And there are other things I can look back on where I felt I did a good job and handled things well. Some of the most difficult issues I faced at the Home Office. I think I built a genuine sense of community across the whole of the Home Office, operational community, for example. Not visible, but I was probably the first permsec to get police, intelligence, security service, borders, etc., firefighters, all around the same table and having the same conversation, and so on. Yeah, that's not a big thing. It's just a meeting, but I think I was building a genuine sort of sense of that joined up government sort of fusion approach that I adopted later. So I'm really proud of all of those things. But if you wanted a single thing that I think probably exemplified that whole ethos that I'd made the focus of my leadership approach, it was probably the way we responded to Salisbury. In terms of the things I got wrong, it's the same thing. So I then thought, I've done this in national security. When I became cabinet secretary, not a job I'd ever aspired to or prepared for. So I had to kind of work out what my agenda was as I took it, because it happened quite suddenly, because Jeremy Hayward fell ill quite suddenly and tragically died only a matter of months later. I had to work out what my agenda was going to be, and I decided my agenda was the same thing, which is I was going to try and apply this joined up government, this fusion approach, more broadly to the rest of the public service, and sort of create multidisciplinary teams, use the kind of agile Scrum like methodologies we'd used in national security elsewhere. And I made the mistake of trying to do everything everywhere all at once. And I just failed because the effort became dissipated. Those who didn't like the idea, silo structures and ethos and culture in government are very, very strong, had plenty of opportunities to frustrate it and did so. And I think what I should have done was have built out from national security where it had proceeded well, not least because I was, everyone kind of believed in it as well there, and try to take it in bite-sized chunks. And I think I might have had more effect in my whole kind of system leadership, et cetera, approach that we've discussed through this podcast. I might have had more success if I'd been probably a little approached with more humility than I did. And if I'd gone slower then, I might have gone faster overall. And so that's a frustration. I'd have liked to have done better at that.
Cool.
Super. Well, look, we have succeeded in doing 10 questions in almost 60 minutes. So if you just stay with us very briefly, Mark, we'll just wrap the podcast because I have an end bit. But before I do that, I just want to say, both from obviously the 2D's point of view, a huge thank you for giving us your time. It's been fascinating. And as we could probably have expanded every single one of those questions into an individual. Not that we're suggesting we should do a series of these, because I think one is you probably survived one session, but we would love to have you back.
I think your audience too.
Yeah. No, but can I just say, Mark, you don't know, right? I think that's what I was going to say to you. Would you mind if we put this out as a visual or cut a few clips out of it and put it on our YouTube? Are you cool with that? Or is that?
Yeah, you can do that. Yeah, sure.
Because I think more people might be interested in 60 Voices if they could see our faces. So you don't know, this might be the catalyst for
you could be a
series.
Without even knowing.
No, bring a friend next time. Bring a friend and a salty snack.
Exactly.
There you go.
Before I wrap, but just to say a massive thank you, and also a big thank you to you for earlier in the year for very kindly sponsoring the Civil Service Retirement Fellowship 60th anniversary reception. A lot of people have dined off that. They still talk about it. They thoroughly enjoyed it. the whole ambiance and everything. So massive thank you for doing that as well. Just to say, obviously, if you enjoyed listening to this episode, you can check out all the other episodes in the 60 Voices podcast on the CSRF's YouTube channel. You can also find out a bit more about us via our website, www.csrf.org.uk, which has full details of all of the charitable services we provide to former civil servants and their dependents, how you can volunteer, and of course, importantly, how you can donate to our Diamond Anniversary Appeal. If you'd be interested in being a guest on a future episode, we'd love to hear from you, and you can email us directly using our inquiries at csrf.org.uk. But all that leaves me to remain to say is a big thank you to all of you for listening, and we will look forward to seeing you on the next episode. So thank you very much indeed.